jet. One time they were just like you. Drinking, smoking, sex, and sniffing glue.
Clearly, throughout recorded history, our civilization's been fascinated by things like the Fountain of Youth and anything that would reverse the aging process because, let's face it, if you're over 40, you feel it physically. Your systems just start to break down. In modern medicine, this process has been seen as disease. But this week's guest, Aubrey de Grey, sees it more like an engineering process. Aubrey is a very controversial biomedical gerontologist and crusader against aging. He has a very specific plan that identifies the various components that cause human tissue to age, and he has very specific remedies for each of them. That's what his nonprofit, the SENS Research Foundation, a 501c3 organization, focuses on, and it's got some interesting people behind it, like Peter Thiel, one of the founders of PayPal, and Aubrey himself, who has invested a large part of his inheritance to the cause. Grow Big Always is often conversations with the rebels that help us reshape the points of view that we take for granted. So Aubrey de Grey is a perfect guest, and I hope you enjoy this conversation that we had via Skype. Maybe you'll end up agreeing with him that the person that ends up living to 1,000 years old has already been born today. This is Grow Big Always. I'm Sam Lawrence. First off, I noticed that your Twitter bio says that you're spearheading the global crusade to defeat aging. So can we just start with, what do you mean by aging? How do you even define what aging is?
Yeah, it's remarkable how many people need that question answered, because to me it's completely obvious what aging is. Aging is simply the accumulation of damage in the body that is caused as a consequence of the body's normal operation. So putting it another way, aging is, at a fundamental level, exactly the same thing in any living organism as what it is in an inanimate machine with moving parts, like a car or an aeroplane or whatever. It's just in the nature of physics that damage happens as a side effect of the operation of any machine. And that's all that aging is.
So does it mean that it starts when the sperm meets the egg?
Absolutely. It absolutely starts before we're born, well before we're born.
So the aging process starts at conception, and it's kind of like we're a machine. As soon as the machine is created, it starts to age. And then what happens that all of a sudden it's a problem?
Well, again, that's just the same as in an inanimate machine, like a car. You know, a car accumulates rust and other stuff starting from the moment it gets on the road, but it only accumulates a problematic amount of rust and other stuff after a while. And that's why you don't need to take a car in for a service the day after you buy it. So, I mean, any machine is set up to tolerate a certain amount of that self-inflicted damage, but only a certain amount.
But if you're fighting to defeat aging, then how do you know it's been defeated?
Great question. So the basic answer is that it's, again, the same as with inanimate machines. The way we know that we have repaired a car and done enough preventative maintenance on a car to know that we have defeated the aging of the car is if it carries on working just as well as it did before we had any of the damage in the first place. In other words, as well as it did when it was manufactured. And it's exactly the same. We will know that we are doing the job properly when we see that people who were chronologically born a long time ago are nevertheless functioning, whether mentally or physically, just as well as young adults.
Call me crazy. I look around the world and see things standing in the face of Mother Nature, like paint on the side of the house, people walking around. mountains, streams, whatever, as just getting beat up by Mother Nature. So when you look around at stuff, what analogy are you using in your head that's different?
It's very simple. You just look at what we already successfully do. A perfectly good example is vintage cars. Vintage cars, they're 100 years old or more, by definition.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact is, they were not designed to last that long. They were just not. They were designed to last maybe 10 or 15 years at the outside. The only reason they have lasted this long is because of periodic, comprehensive, preventative maintenance, which is nothing different from what I'm saying for the human body.
Well, yeah, but with old cars, you can, replace parts, you can replace some of the electrical systems, but it seems like in organic matter, things are all the way down into the cellular level. So I don't know what the analogy would be for a car, but how do you think about that?
Yeah, another great question. But the answer is very simple here as well. The answer is that there is no actual qualitative difference between replacing parts and repairing parts. The only difference that exists between those two things is one's perspective about what scale we're looking at. If we continue with the car analogy, it's perfectly good. You can say, well, okay, replacing the engine of a car constitutes repairing the car. But you can also repair the engine by, for example, replacing the spark plugs, right? And so on down. So repair and replacement are actually not different from each other. They are simply two ways of looking at the same thing. And in the human body, it's just like that. So if we, for example, do stem cell therapy, we are replacing cells that the body is not replacing on its own automatically. That is repair of the tissue that is composed of those cells.
The part that would confuse me is given the interdependency of parts and systems and things at the cellular levels. And by the way, I'm not even close to being in the medical field, so for me to even talk about this is completely ridiculous. But I would imagine that there's such interdependency between all of this stuff inside of us that it's hard to know where to even start. As you're researching this, as you're thinking about the preventative things we could do to defeat aging. So, how do you even frame the problem? Where to even start?
So the first thing I want to say is that it's good that you're coming at this from a non-specialist perspective, because that is what's helping me to demystify the question, to actually, explain how the aging of a living organism is just the same as the aging of a car, and the combating of the aging of a living organism is just the same as the combating of the aging of a car. It's helping. So please do not apologize for that.
Okay, I retract my apology.
So, complexity, absolutely. There's no question the human body is vastly more complicated than a car, or indeed more complicated than any machine that humanity has ever constructed on its own. But that's only a difference of degree. The question, therefore, comes down to how much more complicated is the human body? And
mine's a mess.
Ostensibly, if you look at it just superficially, you'll say, well, a hell of a lot more complicated, so much more complicated that we haven't got a chance. And the only reason that I've been able to come to the conclusion that we're actually not completely out of our depth here is by virtue of the identification of this really important classification, categorization of the different types of damage that the body accumulates. If you look at a car or an aeroplane or whatever, then, there's not many types of damage. And we understand what they are. In the human body, or indeed even a simple living organism, there's far more. There's many, many types of damage that the organism does to itself in the consequence of its normal operation. And we need to fix all of them in one way or another. So you would think, well, that's just far too hard. But the great news is that those many, many different types of damage fall into a very small number, a very manageable number of categories, just 7 categories of damage.
7 categories. Okay, what is that classification all about?
You may think, well, okay, so what? You've got 1,000 different things. There are an awful lot of ways to partition 1,000 things into 7 different boxes. What's so useful about that? The answer is that for each category, there is a generic therapy. So I mentioned stem cells already, right? Now, stem cells, stem cell therapies are used for an awful lot of different things. And it turns out that they can be used for quite a lot of different aspects of aging. Now, different stem cell therapies for different problems do have differences in the details of how they're actually implemented, but only in the details. The reason there is this thing called stem cell therapy is precisely because different stem cell therapies have a lot in common. So, and that's the key thing. That applies to all the other 6 categories as well. We're not just talking about 7 different types of damage. We're also talking about 7 different types of therapy, which jointly have the potential to actually fix all of the stuff we need to fix, and therefore keep our overall load of damage down into a tolerable level.
Okay, well, I'm curious. So what are the 7 different types of damage?
I mentioned one already, cell loss. Cells just dying and not being automatically replaced by the division of other cells. Very simple concept, and it happens all over the body in various ways. In aging, one of the best examples of this is Parkinson's disease, where there's a particular part of the brain where a particular type of neuron dies more rapidly than neurons in most of the brain die, and eventually you don't have enough of them, and you get this problem with the lack of a hormone called dopamine. And that's what causes it. And the fix is stem cell therapy, which indeed is now being implemented in clinical trials to actually really, really cure Parkinson's disease far better than any of the treatments that exist today.
Okay, category 1, cell loss, check.
Then the next 2 categories are both about having too many cells rather than too few. And the reason there are 2 categories is, again, because of the way in which we're going to fix that problem. So the categories are distinguished as follows. The first category is cells dividing when they're not supposed to, which is more or less a definition of cancer.
Okay, so number 2 is cancer.
And the second category is cells not dying when they are supposed to. That's a concept that people often overlook because it seems very counterintuitive that cells would ever be supposed to die. But it turns out that, yes, they do, especially in the immune system. It's really important that cells die when they're supposed to, and they get bad at that late in life.
So number 3 are cells that die when they're supposed to.
And the fixes are, well, in the case of cancer, there's, of course, a lot of people working on a lot of different things. We're working on what you might think of as the backstop. We very much hope that the therapy that we're working on won't actually be needed because it's very elaborate and difficult to implement. But the thing is, it will really, really work. And of course, we've been over-optimistic in terms of simplistic cures for cancer many times over the past 40 years or more. So our approach is to make sure that doesn't happen again.
Okay, but what about the cells that don't die when they're supposed to?
The situation with cells that don't die when they are supposed to is a lot simpler. Essentially, we need to introduce genetic machinery that will override the ways in which those cells are resisting dying, and we can get them to commit suicide even when they're not inclined to. Mm-hmm. That is something that has actually already seen some success in simple models in the laboratory, and it's being commercialized very successfully at the moment. So we're very happy with the way that whole work is going.
Okay, so that's the first 3 categories.
All right, so I've dealt with 3 of the 7 categories so far. The next 2 are things that happen inside cells. So this is not about the number of cells you have, it's about the health of the individual cells. The first one is mitochondrial mutations. So the mitochondria are these very special machines within cells which do the chemistry of breathing. They have this system that combines oxygen with nutrients as a way of extracting energy from those nutrients, which can be used in all manner of ways within the cell. And the special thing about mitochondria is they have their own DNA. This is unique. The rest of our DNA, of course, is located in our chromosomes in the nucleus, but mitochondria have their own. It's very small. They only have a little bit of it, but the 13 proteins that DNA encodes are absolutely essential. And if you get mutations in those genes, then you're in a bad way. So the thing that's interesting is that those mutations happen rather frequently. The mitochondrial DNA, for various reasons, is very much more poorly protected from damage than the nuclear DNA is. So essentially, the real problem is not so much that this DNA exists, but rather its location. If that DNA were in the nucleus, along with the rest of our chromosomes, then we would, we'd be in a different world. We would be able to avoid mitochondrial dysfunction for a lot longer. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to actually relocate that DNA, make copies of it, backup copies, if you like, that are located in the nucleus. They have to be modified in such a way that they still work, and that's not trivial at all, but we're getting there. We published a paper a couple of months ago showing that we're much closer to making that work than anyone's been before.
Okay, so that's mitochondrial. I can't pronounce it. Got it.
The other type of damage inside the cell is a much simpler one to describe. It's just waste products.
Okay, now you're talking my language.
The cell makes a hell of a lot of waste products over its work, and different cells make different waste products. Most of those waste products are either destroyed or excreted, but some of them accumulate really slowly, and evolution has not taken the trouble to invent mechanisms that would do that. So we have to invent them instead, and we're doing that by introducing new genes found in nature, especially in bacteria, which are able to encode enzymes that break down these substances. And we've had great success in alleviating in eliminating the major toxin that drives atherosclerosis in this regard. We've only done it in cell culture so far, but we're very hopeful that this will translate to the clinic fairly soon. The idea is that if you can break down this oxidized cholesterol that really drives atherosclerosis, then the cells that suffer and whose accumulation is really the main problem will just, not suffer in the first place. They'll be able to carry on processing the things that they normally process.
So those are the first 5 categories, and I'm not smart enough to remember them. What are the last 2?
So then there's 2 types of damage that remain to be described, and these ones happen outside the cell, in the spaces between cells. The first one, again, is just like the previous one, molecular waste products. And here it turns out that the material to be destroyed is much easier to destroy than the stuff that naturally accumulates inside the cell. And the result is that if we can just get it inside the cell, then we're done. And it turns out to be fairly straightforward to do that using vaccination. This has already succeeded quite well in Alzheimer's disease. And we've been funding people to work on other aspects of aging that have the same kind of problem. So that leaves just one category, which is cross-linking. So there is this thing called the extracellular matrix, which is a lattice of proteins that holds our body together and gives various tissues their elasticity and such like. And that elasticity turns out to be really important in terms of the function of some of our tissues, especially the major arteries, which need to stretch in response to the heartbeat in order to kind of buffer the more fragile parts of the circulatory system, the capillaries. When that starts to fail, when the major arteries become less elastic, then we get hypertension, we get high blood pressure, and the result is, of course, many things going wrong, including things like kidney failure. So the basis for all of this is a chemical process that occurs between the amino acids that make up the extracellular matrix and the sugar that is circulating in the bloodstream. That chemical reaction just occasionally creates new chemical bonds between proteins of the extracellular matrix. And those additional, unnecessary, spontaneous chemical bonds are a huge problem. They are actually what causes this stiffening. So we need to break those bonds, and we're getting pretty good at that. We're figuring out how to create antibodies and such like that will bind to them and break them. So that's your story.
So here's what I'm struggling with, besides, of course, being able to comprehend nearly what you said in a way where I can be smart and ask you questions back about it. But here's, if I step back and think about the car analogy that you gave me. The thing about a car is I know in my mind's eye what a perfect, 1965 Chrysler XYZ looks like, right? I can picture it. It's got its form. And when I go to restore it, there's a vision I have of it, right? But as you said, we start aging at conception. So what's that perfect form? what is that shutter speed of age? Is it like 23 years old, or like what is that perfect 1960 whatever Chrysler?
Huh. Well, I mean, I guess it's fairly hard to answer that question in detail because the analogy is only meant in relation to the concept of restoration. So, I mean, a 1965 Chrysler is a much more functional, much more modern car than, let's say, a 1925 Ford, right?
Mm-hmm.
Model T, for example. But still, what matters to the people who maintain them is to maintain them in the state that they originally were. Now, we don't need to take into account the fact that cars have become more enhanced as decades have gone on, because humans are not becoming more enhanced, and there's no reason why we would want them to. The important thing is simply that humans are going down, individual humans are going downhill. And if we can maintain an individual human in the same functional state, mental and physical, of course, that they were when they were a young adult, that's equivalent to maintaining a 1965 Chrysler in the state that it was when it was built, and it's also equivalent to maintaining a 1925 Ford Model T in the state that it was when it was built. You see what I'm saying?
I guess what I'm trying to imagine is, let's go into the future and let's pretend that there's a way of, I don't know, inoculating into our bodies a solution to either halt or repair the damage of aging, right? And across the 7 different types that you even described, right? We find a way to go in and clean some of that stuff up and repair it. So is that a future where, depending on what time in our life we start that treatment, the aging process would halt? So, or do you imagine a future where, as normal course of action, human beings are doing some sort of preventative application here at a certain age, and then the world is kind of populated with folks who, I don't know, appear to be 23 but are actually 480?
Mm-hmm. Well, so that's kind of the right question. I mean, ultimately, you need to think about it in exactly the same way that we think about maintaining simple machines like cars. The more you use a machine, the more the machine functions, the more damage it inflicts upon itself, irrespective of how complicated the machine is or whether it's a living organism or anything. Therefore, the process of preserving the health of the machine consists of maintaining the situation in which the machine has a tolerable amount of damage. In other words, the amount of damage that is below the threshold that causes decline in function. And doing that relies on getting rid of damage in that machine as quickly as the machine is creating more damage. You obviously don't have to do it constantly. You can just do it periodically, but you still have to do it. And the more complicated the machine is, the more the types of damage are, and the more challenging it is, because some types of damage may be difficult to fix, or there may be a lot of different types of damage, or any one of which can eventually, cause the machine to fail, even if all the other types of damage are being fixed well. So, the analogy still holds.
Well, look, a lot of people that know me would refer to me as someone that's mentally damaged. But as I think about this, I mean, there's some parts of the brain, right, like a heart, and at the cellular level, and different organs, where we've got science has a pretty good understanding of the functions and how they work and all of that. Now, in the brain, it's a little bit less clear from what I understand. And I wonder, as you look at addressing those 7 different types, is there a chance that when we're fighting aging, we have some effect inside of our brain where our memories, the way that we think, some of the life experiences that we have get, I don't know, somehow jacked with in this process?
Not really, no. It's just like all of these like intuitive analogies and you know, mystical ideas that people get about aging are just wrong. Aging is not a mysterious concept. It really is just no more than what I said. It really is just the accumulation of the damage that the machine that we call the human body does to itself in the course of its normal operation. And we should be able to fix it.
Let's follow the money on this thing, though. So, like, usually when folks are getting grants and they're working on anything that's medically oriented, there's a market on the other side of this, right? So, as you are doing your work and as you're looking at all the different parts of the aging process, I presume you're getting funded by different folks who have different interests in it. And I'd be curious, like, if you were listening to this and you were trying to follow the money of where it's coming from, how do you answer that for folks?
Sure, good question. So, I mean, certainly most of our funding that's happened so far has been from people, whether wealthy people or less wealthy, that have understood that it's just a network of different processes that do interact with each other, but all of which need to be hit, all of which need to be solved. And, it would be nice to be able to, to identify a particular aspect of aging that we could address in this kind of way far more effectively than anybody else. And indeed, that may happen, that, for example, our approach to introducing new enzymes into cells will be the best treatment for atherosclerosis. No, that's just one example. We're trying the same kind of thing for macular degeneration, another really important disease of aging, indeed the number one cause of blindness in the elderly. But at the end of the day, the right thing to be thinking is not about individual specific diseases and short-term money making, because, obviously most money making in the medical profession right now does revolve around individual diseases and individual products that might exist in the near future. The right way to be thinking, that I really need to emphasize to everybody, is that we need to have a comprehensive solution. Yes, it will be a divide and conquer solution consisting of many components, but still it's based on a unified paradigm, a unified way of going about all of this. And that requires an attitude. It requires I wouldn't go so far. I don't want to say a leap of faith, because that sounds like it's not scientific. But I mean, like, a holistic vision of what the whole thing is all about, and a buy-in to the idea that we need to divide the problem into a number of categories and address each of these categories. And we shouldn't expect significant results from the solution of one or two categories. We need to just solve them all.
So I'm 46 years old, and, let's just say I've got some damage, which I'm sure, like I said, I do. Can you paint a picture a little bit? Because this is the part I'm having a hard time imagining. What do I do in a future where you've cracked the code on some of this stuff? Am I taking a pill? Am I getting a shot? Am I swallowing something? Am I being exposed to some sort of vibrational sound waves? What happens?
Well, I mean, of course, the overwhelming majority of the things that we believe are necessary for all this do not yet exist. We've got some stem cell therapies that are going pretty well and some immunotherapies that are going pretty well, but most of the things that need to be done are still in the lab. I mean, a lot of them are not even in mice yet. They're just being done in cell culture. So we've got a long way to go before we actually implement all of this. Mm-hmm. That means that if we ask the question, how will this look when it becomes an actual product, when it becomes something that people are administering to patients, we just really don't know how things have gone, how things will have gone. An example is surgery. So at the moment, it looks quite likely that a lot of the therapies that need to be implemented will most easily and effectively be implemented using transplantation, creating organs in the laboratory, artificial organs with tissue engineering, that will be actually, introduced into the body in very much the same way that an organ transplant happens today with an organ that was taken from someone who recently died. Um, and, that's not the ideal solution by any means. It's something that we would want to move away from as quickly as possible because it's so invasive and so dangerous. Any kind of big surgery like that necessarily is. We want to move in the direction of doing the same thing using stem cell therapies and other such more microscopic interventions. But we don't know how long that's going to take. So, it's all a matter of all hands to the pump. We need to try all the various options that will lead us to the delivery of these rejuvenation technologies.
Whoa, that sounds pretty interventional. Is there stuff we can do, though, right now that isn't as interventional?
I wish. Unfortunately, it looks like no. At the moment, there are lots of things that get an awful lot of attention for their ability to postpone the ill health of old age. And some of them may work a little bit for some people. But the emphasis I want to make is on a little bit. And also, actually, the emphasis has to be on for some people. The fact is that at the moment, the overwhelming evidence shows that evolution has done a pretty good job. In other words, that most of us are living more or less as long as we could. Yes, there's some difference in longevity between some people and other people. Some of that is genetic, which is not a lot you can do about at the moment. Some of it is lifestyle, which is something you can do about if the difference is between average and really bad, like smoking a lot or getting seriously overweight. But it turns out that there's very little you can do to get above average, to improve your longevity. It seems that almost nothing, well, basically nothing has been shown to have such an effect. So, we have to ask, what other things are there? And there's really nothing. There's really nothing you can do. At the moment, we just don't have the technology, the medical technology, to make any difference to how the body will actually accumulate its damage. So at the end of the day, I mean, I know that this is a kind of an unpopular message, but it's the truth. The only thing that you can do for most people to significantly improve your chances of making the cut, so to speak, of actually staying healthy long enough to stay healthy for long enough to stay healthy forever, is to promote the research, to hasten this work that's being done. If you have any money, give it to us. I believe that every individual dollar that is given to this research will save a life. That is the number I get to if I do the calculations, based on my estimates of the rate at which the research is going and the rate at which that research could be accelerated by additional funding. $1 per life. That's pretty interesting to most people, I think.
I asked a question on Twitter to see if anybody had some questions for you before the show. And actually, I got one from Dr. Chris Ryan, who's been on the show. And he asked, maybe a little tongue-in-cheek, I'm not sure, but he asked, to what extent your belief in eternal life or prolonging life fuels any kind of fear you have about your own death.
So first thing I want to say is we do not work on longevity. We do not work on longevity at all. We work on health. All of the stuff about longevity that gets spoken about so much in relation to our work is just a side effect. I mean, it is a side effect. Let's face it. Most people die of being sick. So if you can stop people from getting sick, they're going to live longer on average. Mm-hmm. But that's what we do. It's a side effect. In terms of my own personal motivation, it's the same deal. I really do not think about how long I'm going to live. I genuinely don't. I certainly don't think about how long I want to live. I think that's actually a rather dumb thing to have an opinion about because, let's face it, it's something like, what time do you want to go to the toilet next Sunday? It's something you're going to have an opinion, have more information about nearer the time that you're going to be able to act on. So it's ridiculous to have an opinion about it now.
Oh, great. There goes my chart. I've charted and planned ahead every single bathroom visit in my future. So what does drive you if it's not fear of death?
It is purely humanitarian. I've always been driven by the goal of making a difference to the world. And that ultimately means improving people's quality of life, which is all this is about, right? It's all about improving the human condition. And yes, there will be the side effect of improving people's quantity of life, but that's a side effect.
So what is the one thing you want people to know in these kinds of interviews, when you're at a cocktail party, when you're up on stage delivering some of this stuff, whether it be TED or any of the other places that you've been appearing? What's the one thing that people should always picture in their mind as it applies to this?
Whoa. Well, I think they should picture their parents or their grandparents or anybody else that they know and love that is really sick or was really sick before they died. They should think to themselves, how many people are in that position? How many people they've never met who are in that position every day? And they should think about how important it is to actually stop that from happening.
Aubrey de Grey, it's been fantastic talking to you and having you on the show. Where should people go to learn more?
They should go to our website, sens.org, S for sugar, E for elephant, N for November, S for sugar.org. Just go there. You can find out all about our stuff. You can contact us if you have any questions from the website. It's the right place to go.
Aubrey, thanks for being on Grow Big Always.
Thank you.
Thank you to Aubrey de Grey for being on Grow Big Always. Unfortunately, you could not see his amazing and very Gandalfian beard, so be sure to Google it. In the meantime, head over to Grow Big Always while you're online, and be sure to sign up for the weekly newsletter that goes out every Monday. You'll be reminded that we have a new episode, and you'll see who's coming up next, so that you can even ask us to ask them some questions. As always, thanks for listening.